The first reports that filtered through the communication relays of the Karath Dominion painted humanity in unflattering strokes. A fragile bipedal species with delicate skin, bones that fractured under pressures considered minor, and an organ structure seemingly incapable of withstanding prolonged environmental stress. The analysts compared them unfavorably to the hard-scaled Draxon, the armored Torval, even to the silicon-based creatures of the Arcor, and the conclusion became doctrine. Humans were weak, soft, and likely a temporary anomaly that fate had allowed to survive on an unremarkable blue planet. For the Dominion, which measured strength by endurance of raw force, humans appeared laughably fragile. Observation stations noted the strange obsession humans had with emotional displays, their tendency to mourn their dead with ritual, and their apparent inability to shed attachments. Karath researchers cataloged these as defects. Strength, they reasoned, demanded detachment, and weakness reeked from every aspect of human culture. To the Dominion, war was survival, conquest was logic, and mercy had no place in the calculus of existence. Humanity's history, scattered through intercepted transmissions, seemed filled with contradictions. Moments of brilliance, but stained with chaos, internal conflict, and fragility. This convinced the Dominion even more that the species was inferior. When the first joint expedition was authorized, placing a handful of humans alongside alien researchers on a distant and hazardous planet, the Karath expected little. They wanted to test the durability of these mammals outside their cradle world. The environment chosen was unforgiving. Storms that peeled metal plating from shelter walls, flora exuding corrosive toxins, predators larger than transports. For the Karath, it was an ideal laboratory to demonstrate the superiority of their hardened physiology. For humans, it was assumed to be unbearable. At first, the evidence seemed to support Dominion arrogance. Human skin blistered at the touch of toxic vines. Their lungs struggled in thin air. A fall that would merely bruise a Karath warrior left a human limping for days. The Karath mocked them in private, convinced that fragility defined the species. They mistook every pained expression as confirmation of weakness. They could not comprehend why the humans, coughing blood into the dust, still pushed forward, adjusting, improvising with makeshift tools, wrapping their wounds with strips of fabric. It seemed pitiful, almost laughable, that a species so vulnerable would continue. Yet beneath the ridicule, confusion simmered. The humans did not stop. When one stumbled, the others lifted them. When exhaustion drove them near collapse, they pressed on through sheer force of will. To the Karath, who had evolved in a culture where the weak were left behind, this behavior appeared not only inefficient but absurd. Why waste resources on broken parts? But humans did not view their injured as expendable. They refused to abandon even those slowed by pain. The Dominion expected emotional collapse when a human fell to a predator's claws. They observed mourning, yes, but also something else, something unexpected. The humans did not scatter or surrender to despair. They reorganized, drove sharpened branches into the beast until it retreated, and then carried the wounded home. The grief fueled them, sharpened their determination. Pain, instead of diminishing them, ignited something the Karath could not quantify. One researcher, detached and clinical, noted in his log that humans seemed to metabolize suffering into resolve. Injuries did not deter them, fear did not freeze them, and loss did not dismantle cohesion. It was as if fragility itself had taught them to adapt. The Dominion prided itself on strength of body, but humans revealed another form. Strength of persistence. Where others calculated efficiency, humans chose sacrifice. Where others abandoned, humans clung tighter. Where others recoiled from pain, humans advanced through it. Even in minor tasks, this baffling pattern emerged. A storm shredded a human shelter, leaving the group exposed. The aliens expected panic. Instead, the humans salvaged the wreckage, binding the remnants together with vines, creating a structure far weaker than Dominion technology but sufficient to shield them another night. Their tools broke, but they carved replacements. Their rations dwindled, yet they rationed food with an equality alien to the Dominion. Starvation, which should have fractured them into selfishness, only made them more cooperative. The K-Wrath documented it clinically, but an undercurrent of unease spread. It was not physical superiority that allowed humans to persist. It was something darker, deeper, more primal. Every species developed instincts, but the human instinct to survive defied logic. They did not merely resist death, they wove suffering into a weapon. The Dominion failed to understand the psychology of a species forged in scarcity and danger on its homeworld. Earth, with its diseases, predators, and brutal climates, had shaped a being conditioned to endure through loss. While the K-Wrath admired efficiency, humans had mastered desperation. Pain taught them creativity, fear bound them together, grief became fuel. It was as though their entire evolution had not been about erasing weakness but about wielding it. During one mission, a human's leg shattered under falling rock. The K-Wrath declared them finished, recommending immediate abandonment. But the humans refused. They splinted the leg with bark and cloth, carried the injured comrade across miles of hostile terrain, and endured greater danger because of it. The K-Wrath viewed this as madness. Yet weeks later, the injured one walked again, albeit slowly, and the group celebrated as if victory itself had been achieved. That celebration bewildered the aliens more than anything else. The Dominion began to realize that the human tendency to bear one another's pain created resilience at the group level. Where one failed, others compensated. Where one faltered, others lifted. Pain was never isolated. It was shared, diluted, transformed into determination. This, more than biology, was the first glimpse of their survival instinct. Whispers spread among the observing K-Wrath. If fragility could produce this level of determination, what would desperation create? What would humans do when cornered completely, when resources vanished, when survival meant embracing the darkest corners of their nature? The reports shifted in tone. Where once they mocked, they now described anomalies. Where once they dismissed human tears as weakness, they noted that those tears preceded the fiercest bursts of effort. Where once they scoffed at grief, they acknowledged grief as a catalyst. The humans' so-called weaknesses, cataloged and ridiculed, were becoming a pattern of dangerous resilience. The Dominion began the experiment to prove superiority. Instead, they uncovered a question that gnawed at the edges of their certainty. If weakness drives adaptation and pain breeds resilience, what hidden power lies buried in humanity's darkest survival instincts? And though they would not admit it openly, some of the K-Wrath began to fear that the answer would not favor them. The Dominion's leadership, confronted by the unsettling reports, ordered harsher trials. If humanity's persistence was truly derived from weakness, then greater pressure would surely break them. On a barren moon orbiting a collapsing star, they forced the humans into conditions designed to extinguish all hope. The atmosphere was thin, toxic storms swept the surface, and resources were almost non-existent. Dominion warriors were placed alongside them as silent witnesses, tasked with measuring the inevitable collapse. Yet the collapse never came. The humans began by failing spectacularly. Their lungs burned in the thin air, their flesh blistered from corrosive rains, and their meager shelters crumbled under the weight of constant storms. Food supplies, already meager, dwindled within days. The K-Wrath recorded each human injury, each death cough, each ragged gasp, certain that they were watching a species near its limit. But as conditions worsened, the strange human instinct surfaced again. The very scarcity that should have broken them ignited a desperate ingenuity. Rocks were carved into cutting tools. Poisonous plants were dissected, boiled, filtered, until some became edible. Rainwater, corrosive at first, was trapped and filtered through layers of fabric and sand, until it no longer seared their throats. Every failure became fuel for the next attempt. Where other species faced walls, humans carved doorways with bloodied hands. The Dominion warriors began whispering among themselves, their arrogance faltering. No training manual had prepared them for this spectacle. They had faced strong foes before, enemies who fought fiercely until crushed. But this was different. The humans did not fight as predators or soldiers. They fought as survivors, every breath another act of defiance. The more suffering piled upon them, the more creative they became. It was as though pain unlocked some hidden reservoir of possibilities no logical strategist could anticipate. Night after night, they endured storms that stripped the surface bare. Fires failed, shelters collapsed, bodies trembled from exhaustion. Yet morning always found them rising again, adjusting, building anew, salvaging shards of survival from the wreckage. Each human wound healed into scar tissue, each scar a silent lesson. Their weakness remained visible, but it was no longer weakness. It was adaptation etched into flesh. The Dominion had miscalculated another crucial detail. Humans did not endure alone. Fear, which fractured other species, became glue among them. When hunger gnawed at their stomachs, they rationed food so evenly that no one grew strong while others starved. When one faltered, another shouldered their weight. The Dominion, who despised inefficiency, saw waste in this. But what they did not see was that this unity multiplied their strength. Alone, a human was fragile. Together, they became something unstoppable. The first true shock to the Dominion came when they observed a human mother figure within the group offering her share of food to a younger one, day after day, until her body began to wither. To the Karath, this was madness, an act of suicide. But the child survived, and when the mother finally collapsed, the rest of the group carried her for days, refusing to abandon her. And somehow, against all odds, she lived, though frail. This act unsettled the Dominion observers more than violence ever could. For them, strength was the ability to endure personally. For humans, strength seemed to mean something else entirely, the willingness to sacrifice for another. Reports sent back to the Dominion High Council grew darker in tone. Analysts no longer wrote of weakness but of unpredictability. A fragile species should crumble under starvation, but humans seemed to grow sharper. A fragile species should surrender when wounded, but humans transformed wounds into fuel for ferocity. A fragile species should fear death, but humans seemed to twist death into purpose. Each fallen companion did not diminish their spirit but hardened it. The Dominion soon escalated the trials again. They introduced predators genetically designed to hunt in toxic atmospheres, creatures with scales impervious to crude weapons. They were expected to thin the humans quickly. Instead, the observers watched the humans study their hunters. They learned their patterns, tracked their weaknesses, baited them into traps. They sharpened bones into spears, wove nets from torn garments, and used the terrain as weapons. In time, the hunters fell, not because humans were stronger but because they refused to accept defeat. Every claw wound, every shredded limb, became another lesson carved into their memory. Their survival instinct was not built on avoiding pain but on embracing it, shaping it, using it as a blade. The Karath warriors began to feel something they had never associated with this fragile species: fear. It was not the fear of overwhelming might, but of something far more insidious. These humans were not surviving despite their fragility. They were surviving because of it. Pain was not their end. It was their beginning. One Dominion soldier confided in his log that he dreamt of human eyes staring at him from the dark, eyes hollowed by hunger yet burning with resolve. He admitted he would rather face a battalion of armored foes than a single starving human who had nothing left to lose. It was the first time in his life he questioned the Dominion's definition of strength. Weeks passed on the toxic moon. By every logical measure, the humans should have perished. Instead, they thrived in their own brutal way. Scarred, thinner, slower but alive, and more dangerous than ever. They had become creatures molded by suffering, bound together by sacrifice, sharpened into something the Dominion could not classify. The final test came when the Dominion abruptly withdrew the support transports, leaving the humans with no promise of rescue. The intention was to observe psychological collapse, to see despair claim them at last. But the opposite happened. Stripped of all illusions, the humans turned fully inward, relying on nothing but themselves. Instead of despair, purpose grew sharper. They did not wait for rescue. They built signals, carved paths, mapped terrain, and adapted to the idea that they might live their entire lives on that cursed moon. They accepted it without surrendering. For them, survival itself became victory. When Dominion ships finally returned months later, the humans were unrecognizable. Starving, scarred, battered, but standing, glaring into the alien lights as though daring them to impose another test. The observers who stepped off the ships felt their composure falter. This was not the weakness they had been promised. This was not fragility. This was something else entirely. The revelation that humanity's darkest survival instinct was not to simply live, but to refuse to die even when death was certain. Back in the halls of the Dominion, arguments erupted. Some called for immediate extermination of humanity before this dangerous instinct spread across the stars. Others urged restraint, recognizing that to provoke such a species might awaken a fury beyond imagining. For the first time in their long history, the Dominion did not know if they had discovered prey, or a predator far more terrifying than themselves. The Dominion High Council convened in chambers carved from living stone, their voices reverberating in cold harmony. The question was no longer whether humans were weak, but whether they were too dangerous to exist unchecked. Some argued extermination, citing the growing evidence that pain did not weaken humanity but transformed them. Others urged restraint, pointing out that a species capable of bending suffering into strength could become either a formidable ally or an unstoppable enemy. For the first time in centuries, the Dominion wavered. To resolve the debate, they escalated once more. They took the strongest humans from the toxic moon and placed them on a new world, one designed as a crucible rather than a cage. The planet was a graveyard of forgotten wars, scarred by radiation storms and crawling with machines left behind from battles fought long before humanity's rise. No food, no shelter, only ruins and relics of violence. The expectation was that this place would finally expose the limits of their survival instinct. But the humans adapted faster than even the boldest analysts predicted. Their first instinct was not despair but exploration. They mapped the ruins with relentless precision, scavenging scraps of metal, wiring, and broken circuits. Where another species saw rubble, they saw potential. Within days, they had crafted tools, weapons, and crude shelters from the husks of machines. Their scars had not only hardened their bodies but sharpened their minds. Pain had burned hesitation out of them. Now they attacked each problem with ruthless creativity. When radiation storms swept across the surface, they dismantled machinery to build shielding. When drones reawakened from centuries of slumber and attacked, they studied their patterns and repurposed their remains. Each human death was mourned, but each also became a catalyst for new strategies. It was as though every loss carried weight, binding the survivors closer, pushing them harder. For the Dominion observers, it became unbearable to watch. Every failure should have broken them, yet each failure produced innovation. The Dominion soldiers sent to monitor them began speaking less of weakness and more of inevitability. They confessed to each other that if given enough time, humans would not just survive but thrive, reshaping any hostile environment into their own domain. It was not strength of muscle, nor superiority of weapon, but sheer refusal to surrender. It was an instinct that no data model could predict, because it thrived precisely where logic declared impossibility. The humans began hunting not just to eat, but to dominate their environment. When they discovered that machines stalked the ruins by responding to energy signals, they learned to mimic those signals, luring drones into traps and dismantling them for parts. What began as desperate scavenging became deliberate control. Soon, the ruins bent to their will. Dominion analysts who once wrote about prey under pressure now documented a species carving dominance out of ashes. Fear spread within the Dominion ranks. Soldiers who had once looked upon humanity with contempt began to whisper of them with reverence. They no longer described humans as fragile but as relentless, as if fragility itself was a mask concealing a weapon forged from suffering. One soldier remarked that humans were not like any other prey. Prey flees or dies. Humans neither flee nor surrender. They endure, and in enduring, they evolve into something predators cannot match. The turning point came when the Dominion deliberately unleashed an engineered plague across the ruins, a final attempt to see if disease would succeed where storms, hunger, and predators had failed. The virus spread quickly, searing fevers and rotting flesh, designed to erase every last spark of resistance. The Dominion had used it before to wipe entire colonies from existence. It should have been decisive. But once again, humans defied expectation. They did not crumble. They bled, they convulsed, they buried their dead, but they refused to vanish. Instead, they began experimenting with crude methods of containment. They separated the sick, burned contaminated shelters, fashioned masks from rags soaked in herbs and ash. They used instinct to approximate quarantine, trial and error to find small measures that slowed the spread. Many perished, but those who survived carried immunity, and that immunity became strength. Within months, the humans stood alive where the Dominion had expected silence. The plague had not erased them. It had made them harder. The Dominion counselors argued with rising dread. Some demanded extermination before humanity spread further, while others warned that extermination itself might be impossible. For every attempt to crush them, humans emerged sharper, harder, more united. What the Dominion had witnessed was not resilience alone, but transformation. Pain was not their end state. Pain was the fire in which they were reforged. Whispers spread beyond the council chambers. Dominion soldiers began refusing to participate in the trials. Some admitted they dreamed of humans hunting them through the ruins, relentless and unbroken. Others claimed that every scar on human skin was a warning, a record of lessons learned in blood that could never be unlearned. Fear turned to awe, and awe began to crack the Dominion's once unshakable hierarchy. The humans themselves did not know the depth of the impact they were having. To them, survival was not a performance but necessity. They rose each day, scarred and starving, and did what had to be done. They were not aware that their simple refusal to yield had unsettled one of the most dominant empires in the galaxy. They only knew that each breath mattered, that each day alive was a victory carved against the void. As years passed within the Dominion's controlled experiments, the humans began shaping myths among themselves. Stories of survival were passed like torches, giving meaning to their scars. They spoke of those who had fallen not as victims but as pillars upon which the rest had climbed. They turned tragedy into legacy, death into instruction. No suffering was wasted. No pain was meaningless. This cultural alchemy terrified the Dominion more than physical endurance. A species that transformed agony into purpose was a species that could not be broken. The High Council at last faced the truth. Humans were not weak. They were not fragile. They were not prey. They were something new, something dangerous, something that weaponized suffering itself. The Council could not decide whether to destroy them before it was too late, or to recognize that such a force, once unleashed, might become the most terrifying ally in the galaxy. The final reports carried a line that echoed through every chamber of Dominion power. Humans are not dangerous because they are strong. They are dangerous because no matter what we do, they refuse to die. The words hung like prophecy. And across the stars, whispers of humanity spread, not as prey to be conquered, but as survivors to be feared. For the first time in the Dominion's long reign, the predators began to wonder if they had accidentally birthed the one force that could end them. The Dominion's empire stretched across thousands of systems, yet the smallest fraction of its resources had been devoted to studying humanity. What began as an experiment in dominance had grown into a crisis of identity, for the Dominion could not reconcile what they had witnessed. Generations of conquest had taught them that prey submits, predators consume, and hierarchy is eternal. Humanity had not only defied that law, they had rewritten it. The moment the Council acknowledged this, fear transformed into obsession. They needed to understand, to dissect the secret that allowed humans to transmute pain into power. Scholars argued it was biology, some genetic quirk that hardened them under stress. Others insisted it was psychological, a neural architecture wired to find meaning where none should exist. A faction even claimed it was cultural, that humans carried in their myths and stories a kind of weaponized memory, passing survival lessons forward like encoded instructions. Yet no single explanation sufficed. Humanity's strength was not one thing but everything woven together. Biology, psychology, and memory fused into instinct. They could not be reduced to a single weakness. The Dominion tried infiltration. Agents approached survivors, offering relief, food, even promises of freedom. In every other species, desperation bought obedience, but humans treated kindness with suspicion and betrayal with fury. The infiltrators were exposed, hunted, and cast out. Dominion scientists began recording a chilling conclusion. Humans had learned to resist not only suffering but manipulation. They had developed a kind of immunity to control, forged by centuries of deception and oppression among their own kind. Their history had been practiced for this very moment. To test this further, the Dominion isolated a group and attempted to introduce hierarchy among them by rewarding a chosen few with extra supplies. It should have fractured them into factions, as had happened with countless species before. But humans turned the experiment upside down. Instead of hoarding, the chosen shared. Instead of dividing, they unified. The Dominion could not compute this. Rewards designed to corrupt were repurposed as glue, tightening their bonds. Even their selfish instincts became weapons of survival when redirected toward unity. In secret, Dominion soldiers began recording human sayings, fragments of their speech translated into trembling alien tongues. One phrase repeated often, "What doesn't kill us makes us stronger." It seemed childish at first, simplistic, yet it became the most dangerous sentence the Dominion had ever heard. For in that phrase was a creed, a worldview in which failure, pain, and death itself were not finality but transformation. It was an inversion of everything the Dominion believed, a philosophy that ensured that no act of cruelty could ever be final.